Welcome to the 2022 Digital Innovation Futures Festival, put on each year by the Victorian Government to celebrate the technological advances in Victorian businesses in almost every field you can imagine. Good evening, Carolyn here from We Teach Well. This is our second session in the Digital Innovation Futures Festival in 2022. And we have the privilege of being able to talk to some really great educators about how technology has been and can be used in an education setting. The three wonderful educators that you are about to meet tonight, that is Adriano De Plato, Ruth Smith, and Matthew Harrison, have all spent time working at in technology, but more importantly, working at ways that technology can be used to level the playing field in education. If you've seen our website or listened to us very much, you know that reducing educational inequality, or more importantly, promoting educational equality, is the business of We Teach Well. No need to hear more from me, much better to hear from these amazing panelists. Thanks to all of you for showing up today and giving of your time. It is much appreciated as we look at technology and how it can be used in it from the future. I mean, we've learned in the last couple of years that actually we can move a lot faster than we do. And thank you again, because I think this is a really important conversation. But before we begin, We Teach Well acknowledges the sovereignty of the traditional custodians of the lands where we live and work. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and that the land is and always will be Aboriginal land. As an education business, We Teach Well recognises the value of traditional Aboriginal education systems and promotes increased Aboriginal involvement in education at state and federal level. So today I'd like to introduce you to an amazing panel of speakers. First of all, Adriano De Plato, who has a long history working with the Catholic education system. And when he left Catholic at the end of 2019, I believe, he co-founded A School for Tomorrow, which is a global education network supporting students, teachers, and school leaders to thrive in our new world. With his co-founder, Dr. Phil Cummins, he co-hosts the Game Changers podcast. And in 2022, The Educator magazine listed Adriano in their top 50 most influential educators in Australia, which is pretty cool. The thing that bugs me about it is the thing about starting their podcast like 2 years ago, and they've got 11 seasons done already, and I can't even get season 2 off the ground. Then there is Matthew Harrison. Matthew, as a K-12 teacher, researcher, and digital creator, works through Melbourne Graduate School of Education, promoting the effective use of technology to enhance social capacity building, belonging, and inclusion in education. And if you can make the learning games-based, so much the better. Matthew's work in the value of game-based activities in education is fascinating. And last but definitely not least, Ruth Smith. Ruth is the middle years middle years program coordinator through the International Baccalaureate and head of program teaching and learning at Callum Vale Community College, one of only a few public schools to run the International Baccalaureate program in Australia. She is skilled in the areas of e-learning, educational technology, and instructional design. Ruth has proven experience in education management, which makes her a perfect person to address systemic inequality and how it can be managed by school leaders. The internet and emerging technologies offer great opportunities to reduce educational inequality on a global scale, but we have to make sure it doesn't go the wrong way. There are a number of issues and topics within this very large field that we can't possibly deal with totally today. But I'd like to, first of all, ask each of you what you think is the most important thing we need to do to stop technology making the gap bigger. Start with Matthew, you're top left of my screen. Very democratic, this.
It is, thank you. And I'll have my turn first this time, and maybe I can go last next time. That sounds very fair. I think the biggest thing that we can do in terms of what we need as a society is sustained government investment in quality public education. And that means proper resourcing around digital resources for all kids, but doing it in a needs-based way. I really do think that's the future, that we do ensure that every child has access to a high quality digital technologies program that includes both digital literacy, but also the computer science elements of digital technologies. It's something that I do see now as the greatest divide between our students who have access to high quality resources and not necessarily high quality teaching, but high quality resources and the opportunities they have for learning that other kids don't have.
One of the things that I would have got Emma to speak to at the beginning of not last year. So we were into the COVID thing, and students at this private school were having boxes delivered to their homes that included everything that they needed to create a small robot, which is awesome. Emma had a teacher in rural Victoria who had to go walk up the hill at 5 o'clock at night because that was the only time he could get access to the internet to get his materials going. It's a story on that.
I heard so many stories like that, Carolyn. You know, in my role, Digital Learning and Teaching Victoria, I serve on the board, and we've got a diversity of teachers from both independent, Catholic, and from the public sector. And it's really what really I think we learned from the last couple of years, and the research around this is really quite evident, is particularly for the kids that I work with disabilities and neurological differences typically, that the quality of their remote learning experience across all learning areas was heavily influenced by their access to high quality supports, resources. And the internet is a big part of that.
Moving through, Adriano?
Sure. Carolyn, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be present with you all today. And it's great to meet Matt and Ruth in this cyber space, the irony that we're talking about digital technologies. In response to your question around whether or not we can ensure, access to technology no longer contributes to further inequity in our system, the school working environment has no parallel to any other office environment on shining a spotlight on real disadvantage and inequity. And that's what I've always felt. So I feel those in schools can definitely speak on this topic of equity and disadvantage with much authority. The pivot toward an online kind of learning delivery model over the last 2 years demonstrated the tragedy that is the global digital divide. I mean, that was really obvious. And I think, Matthew, that's what you've illustrated really profoundly by saying that those who did not have access were severely impacted upon. Yeah. Last year, the World Economic Forum published an article called 3 Ways the Coronavirus Pandemic Could Reshape Education. And one of the issues that they raised in their article was, in fact, that the digital divide could widen as only 60% of the world's population has access to this online kind of learning opportunity. In Australia, when lessons transitioned to this online space, Some children had been impacted because of their personal circumstance, or because of the cost of the digital devices, or the lack of connectivity to a data network. These were all serious prohibitive factors. So to answer your question in the Australian context, Carolyn, if we are truly committed to realising goal number 1 of the 2019 Alice Springs Declaration of, and that goal is the Australian education system promotes excellence and equity, whether it's in person or online, governments and school systems with technology manufacturers and telecommunication partners must truly embrace equity of access for all and work towards developing ways to decrease costs and increase the quality of access for our young people in our care. I mean, it's our responsibility in schools, or our responsibility in schools, I should say, can no longer limit or be limited to the boundaries of our campus. We know that technology is going to be an important element of future learning or a hybrid model. And we also need to recast the purpose of schooling to support local community, and we need to be open to partnering with other schools and the private sector to bring educational outcomes to a broader audience, particularly those who are living in disadvantaged or in rural or kind of remote areas. And we can no longer just sit back and wait for this to happen. We've got to actively do something about it.
I was just thinking of the, I'll come back to it, the recent meeting of education ministers. And I shall come back to that. Ruth, what do you think is the most important thing we need to do?
Well, firstly, Caroline, thank you so much for your invitation for this. It's an honour to be able to, I guess, represent my school and schools like mine from around Australia. My school is a metropolitan school, though, and yes, we're a P to 12, but we're, I guess, firmly situated within Middle Australia, and we've got quite a interesting demographic because it's very culturally diverse, and it includes students from a wide range of socioeconomic groups. So when the pandemic first hit, one of the things that we experienced was whilst many of our students do have access, some don't, there are social issues that go along with this as well. So, for example, with the loss of employment with parents, the students who were actually able to go out and work because they was, 14, 15, 16 or whatever, ended up taking more hours of work because they needed to support their families. Yeah. So without investment in the social structures surrounding this as well, this is part of a larger networked problem. Problems don't exist by themselves. They're part of a much larger, social network to go along with this. And I would imagine that, for rural students, in some ways, that's also exacerbated because they do have obligations in terms of, if they're out on farms and things like that, or if they're in employment. So some of our students we didn't see at all during that time period because they were too busy helping their families to survive and getting the hours in for those sorts of things. I'd like to second and support what both Matt and Adriana have said. And I think what we also need to invest in is teachers and their pedagogy, because if we, without helping teachers to see that this is not just another replacement for a blackboard or a whiteboard, sorry, I'm showing my age here, then, how do you effectively use and include students? How do you actually teach and structure learning for neurodiverse students in an online platform, particularly those who may experience quite a deal of exhaustion that goes along with this? It's actually, in some ways, a lot harder for students to interface because of the exhaustion that comes along with it. And I guess a lack of understanding of what the demands are on the kids, particularly our neurodiverse kids, is really critical. And I actually saw that in my sons in my own house. One coped very well and the other did not. The other thing is that we need to look at the resilience of our young people and their ability to concentrate, because if you put a digital device in front of a teenager, work will probably be one of the things towards the bottom of the agenda that you can use it for. And making sure that kids are actually engaged in learning, and that gamification of it is something that I think we need to look more at. How do we not just replicate a boring traditional environment in the classroom? How can we actually engage kids using technology through purposeful pedagogy? It's not just about necessarily always using technology as well. You have to select the right tool for the right purpose at the right time and for the right student. And that can look quite diverse in many cases.
Carolyn, I think, Ruth raises some really interesting points there around the social construct of how schools can best respond to the immediate needs of each individual within their community. What's really fascinating in Ruth's response for me is that there is a clear thread that we have to keep reminding ourselves that every young person in our community and the adults that serve them are home to a life. And if we are really serious about looking at issues of inequity, period, whether it's being done on an on-campus experience and face-to-face, which has obviously great value for young people, particularly between the character apprenticeship between the teacher and the student, the peer exchange that goes on in that social construct. But also, if we're to leverage the best parts of technology, and let's say that everyone did have access, equality of access, and equality to the devices, which we know is a massive thing to still overcome. I love Ruth's point around purposeful pedagogy, because the reality is what we witnessed in the last 2 years is that many schools simply pivoted their on-campus experience and model to an online model. And of course, it led to exhaustion, not only of the young people, of themselves, and if we're really serious about this, we need to invest in building the capacity of the adults to realize that how we deliver learning and construct learning and make meaning on an online space is dramatically different to the way in which we would do it in an in-context experience or an on-campus experience. And that's got to be part of the conversation. But we can only have that when the system itself is prepared to start looking inward and realizing that perhaps there are so many elements of what we currently deliver that are no longer serving us, and they haven't served a large portion of our community, particularly our neurodiverse members of our community.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's pretty. Oh, sorry, Ruth.
That's okay. Go first. Go for it.
No, I was just going to say on the point about the pivot, what's really interesting is an attempted pivot, I believe, Adriano. But if you look over my shoulder, on my other shoulder, I've got an AAC device. Some of the kids I work with, they use these communication devices. And what the schools found very quickly was that a lot of our kids lost the ability to communicate with their peers when they try to just replicate that classroom teacher-centered position. So when you do have the teacher at the very trying to learn how to use Zoom or WebEx at the same time as these children trying to use their AAC devices and hold them up to the camera on these tiny windows, they lost the functional ability to communicate, which is central to us as every human, be able to interact with each other. So it became a human rights issue. And we did a lot of research around following families. And Ruth, I'd love to hear your experiences as a parent as well, as how do we try to rethink the way we're doing things to ensure that people don't lose the affordances of in-person schooling, but how can we reimagine those affordances in a way that allows us to work remotely? So I'd love to hear what you have to say, Ruth.
I was actually going to talk a little bit about what Adriano said briefly as well. Until I saw Heidi Hayes-Jacobs speak a little while ago about different types of digital pedagogies and pedagogies in general, and the fact that we do have classic pedagogies. So pen and paper, face-to-face communications, those sorts of things are still classic pedagogies. We do have outdated pedagogies as well. And unless we're critical about what we choose, when we choose it for, then, technology is not going to be used well, and it's not going to be used to its full potential for all of these students. In terms of my experience as a parent, I've got two very different children at home, and one coped extremely well, but he was off doing all sorts of other things because he finished his work too quickly, playing games with his friends online and things like that. And it was quite interesting walking into their rooms and seeing the split screening going on between, hey, I've got this game going, but I've got my English lesson over here, and what they were up to. The other one, because of the nature of his need to communicate and connect with people really struggled, and ended up with some mental health implications because of it. And I think that that's something as well that we need to address that goes alongside this, that there are mental health implications that have occurred for many of our students because of a lack of communication, lack of understanding of the learning, particularly for our neurodiverse students. My son is neurodiverse. He's has ADHD, and he found it really, really difficult. And that resulted in some not great learning that happened as he went through it. And I'm sure many parents have similar experiences, and some would have, some far worse experiences.
Yeah, I have twin boys, and they're as unlike each other as chalk and cheese. One functions well. Benjamin would have done relatively well in the social stuff. Jeremy needs the he's a bit more introverted, doesn't want people to bother him. But one of the things that I've decided I'm taking on, I campaigned for re-education to believe that actually neurodiversity is the normal, and that everyone, I mean, you've got two children, they're different. They function differently. You have a class of 26 children, they're all going to function differently. Neurodiversity is normal. It's the Greeks and Aristotle who messed it all up with their dualism and stuff. I think we need to, that each of you have talked about the neurodiverse. And in some ways, I think we treat neurodiversity as a small percentage of the population. I think we have to think about it a lot bigger. And how can we offer each of these? Some children, high school is not a safe space. It can be quite a damaging space. So what are the options that we can give students to get the learning they need in different ways?
Carolyn, I'm just conscious that people that are tuning in and listening to this conversation, and the initial question that you asked the three of us was around access to technology that does not further perpetuate inequality. I don't want the audience to automatically just think that we're talking about the stuff that we should be concerned about or that we need to have at the forefront of our mind and to be addressing. And can I say, working with over 100 plus schools across the globe during the pandemic, as with our organisation, A School for Tomorrow, what we witnessed some outstanding models of education where they really, really consciously listen to the inherent needs of their community, try to build the capacity of their staff as they're building this plane. They're flying this plane while they were building it, I should say. And at the same time, we also saw lots of examples of students, even students that have been diagnosed with a neurodiverse need or condition, presented showing great gains from this opportunity when the conditions were right, when there was a balance between the focus of wellness coming first, where they understood that time had to be fluid, and they would create a construct of then the timetable with short synchronous lessons and lots of opportunity for asynchronous times and lots of online opportunity where they're building, as Matt illustrated, they simply focused on connectivity and how to build connectivity. There wasn't any new learning happening there. There wasn't any, new emails of new assignments due. It was simply about building relationship. The schools that did this well and realized that community is king, whether it's online or in person, they flourish this in this environment. We've just got to start recognizing that technology is a powerful tool, and when used purposefully and authentically, can actually support the notion of anytime, anywhere, by anyone learning. And we also have to realize that there's so much research, of course, we know about this new world that we're currently living in and the world that our young people are going to lead. And so much of that requires them to be digitally literate and to play in a space where technology is not going to be just pervasive. It's just the reality of their workplace. And I just feel that, we can no longer kind of delay the importance of an online learning module or hybrid paradigm for all future learning, because without technology, this is a strong statement, it might be provocative, but without technology, schools will become irrelevant.
Yep.
And we need to start thinking about how we can do learning in an equitable way to better reach it. Some of these schools were actually saying that it was their ASD students that were most connected when the school was deeply conscious about their social and emotional needs as well as their cognition needs. But it's a consciousness, right? But can I say that's the same as whether it's on campus?
Exactly.
You know, the on-campus experience. Like I remember leading a school and making sure that we ensured that our students that were on the spectrum, they received their semester 2 timetable 3 weeks before anyone else, so that we could work with them and their aides to find their new rooms, to be introduced to their new teachers, you know, to help with that transition, because that's very confronting for them. It's going to be a total new environment with a new class of students. That's a whole reset that can freak people out, right? And so if we're deeply conscious about the inherent needs of these individuals, we have to be best prepared for that. And we can only do that when we position wellness first.
Yep. And relationship.
I like the point, Adriana, that you make about voice, that it's important to listen and understand from the point of view of the people who are involved. And I think sometimes we make assumptions about what that is without necessarily listening to the voice of the students or their families or to the teachers who are involved in it. And you know, when you listen, sometimes you learn some very surprising things.
And this speaks to the point of technology being a tool, the affordances of technology. So it's a tool that allows us to enhance voice. So the idea that we can use multiple modes of communication. So students who prefer to be non-verbal, non-speaking, or students who prefer other ways or modes of communication can still have their voices heard. And I think that's so important, Ruth. The idea is that we meet our children and young adults at where they're at, in terms of how they prefer to communicate. I know lots of the young people I work with become very anxious when they feel disconnected, or when they feel like they're not sure about what's going to happen. So they will prefer sending a text. They will prefer sending an email to explain what they're thinking and what their concerns are. So it's really opening up those channels of communication, saying it's fine, it's okay. It's you know, let me know how I can help you, because the last couple of years have been pretty tough for all kids, I think, and teachers, of course. I've got more grey hair now, Carolyn.
I didn't notice. I had a son who's one of my boys was dyslexic, and it didn't matter how much he knew or how much effort he put in. When he had to write an essay about it, it was always going to be poor. Whereas if you'd put the entire curriculum on video, he would have been able to repeat it to you word for word. It could have been so much easier for him if English and other humanities didn't put most of their assessment into writing tasks. There are a lot of students out there who don't get the opportunity to show how much they can do if we are always going to base it on how they write.
Caroline, I think you're raising a significant point here, because I mean, in the absence of educators and the system and governments not being conscious to the diverse needs within our communities, that's the point I was making at the very top of this show. You know, schools are there is no probably workplace that has such understanding of disadvantage or inequity than anyone else. When we are deeply conscious of these things, it's transformational. I've been working with the South Australian Catholic Education Office to develop an entrepreneurial model for K through to 12. They call it reception through to 12. And one of the things that we've developed is a design thinking toolkit, digital design thinking toolkit platform to empower students and teachers. Every single section of what we're creating has a video instructional piece that has closed caption on it as well. So So we're just conscious there's going to be people that have got a hearing impediment that could benefit from the closed captioning. We're conscious that there will be students that present with dyslexia, and they would benefit from the video instruction as opposed to large slabs of text. We're also conscious that we made the text really short, small instructional pieces, signposting, really good simple steps that irrespective of your cognitive needs, you'll be able to access this. But this all comes around intentional design of curriculum and access to curriculum that is deeply conscious of everyone's needs. And can I tell you, when you are conscious, you discover that diversity is our inherent strength, right? And that we can really achieve so much when we understand all of that. And no one should be excluded, because that's our mission in schools. Excellence and equity. It's not just excellence. It's not just achievement. It's about this equity piece. And it's achievable when we're conscious.
Yep. Thinking about those sorts of things, you hear a number of phrases thrown up, like digital passports, micro-credentialing, and obviously a big one, which is cybersecurity. And I'd like us to separate the cybersecurity one just and look at some of those, the couple of others there. I guess the idea there is that rather than study for show up at school for 6 months, then you get all your exams and you get a report card at the end of 6 months, and then you do the same for the next semester, and that just keeps going for 13 years. The idea that maybe students can do units that they can carry with them, especially if you're going to be working through 2 states. So I worked in Victoria and in Queensland. My kids had different spaces where they worked. If they could have carried with them units that they had completed effectively or learned in a society where we were all moving around a lot before COVID, what's the value of some of those ideas? Okay, all jump in at once.
Go ahead, Matt. You go ahead, mate.
Ruth, did you want to go first? I saw you reaching for your unmute there. Micro-credentialing is a really interesting one, because it's about the idea. Why do we have micro-credentials to start with? Why do we have any credentials? It's to demonstrate that you have a particular set of knowledge or skills. So I work for, I work for an institution that's been doing it for almost 200 years, credentialing and saying that this person has this certification and should be able to do these things based on the assessment they've conducted. That we'll vouch for them in saying that they will be able to teach, have the foundational knowledge and skills to be able to teach effectively, in the School of Education. Now, the idea of currency in terms of a micro-credential, who's it for and what's the value? There are really big equity questions here around this. The idea of, I don't know what Ruth and Adriana, how you feel about this as well, but the idea of, is this just something where you've got the traditional providers be able to share their knowledge and their skills? So is it Melbourne Uni? Is it Monash Uni? Is it University of New South Wales sharing, basically rebadging and having micro-credentials? Or are we allowing new voices into the fray here and allowing new sets of knowledge and skills to be shared? And how do we know that as a consumer, or as a student who wants to get a micro-credential, that this particular experience is going to be high quality? Who's regulating that? And these are really important questions. So it's about gatekeeping in terms of equity, but also how do we make sure from the student side that they're going to get a high quality experience? What's the regulation around this? Do we deregulate it completely? Can anyone offer a micro-credential? What are these are big questions around equity and access.
Yeah, I think you raised some really interesting points there, particularly around the credibility of what's on offer. I want to touch upon that in a moment, Matt. For me, micro-credentials allow people. I want to start with the opportunity of them first before I get into the challenges. I feel that micro-credentials can allow people to dip in and out of education at a very affordable cost. And they have the potential to address probably the two most common barriers cited by adult learners and workers who are not intending on maybe undertaking a formal bit of study, which is fundamentally time and cost. Right? These are often two of the biggest barriers for the adults in the world, right? Therefore, if we translate that into a secondary setting for young people around this equity and access piece, then it goes back to our initial conversation we were having a moment ago about what does that model really look like and how do we best serve these young people from a time context and of course a cost context. But these micro-credentials do allow people to dip in and out. It does allow them at this stage at the moment to be really affordable. Not necessarily for everyone, but for a lot of people. It's a greater scope than, say, a full qualification or degree at university, which is quite a substantial fee. It can meet their immediate learning needs, and it can meet their kind of future needs, as well as, in the case of adults, it can meet their kind of current employment needs, right? As well as it could support future employment needs of young people. Often micro-credentials focus on this skill development, as you mentioned, Matt, and can maybe close skill gaps that individuals might have or industries might have. The aspiration is that students then would be able to access smaller bites of learning that suit either their immediate needs, their interests, or their future pathways. Now, from my perspective, universities and other educational institutions can develop these short duration qualifications, whether it's online or face-to-face, I should say, that are easily recognisable and built upon between institutions, making these kind of micro-credentials portable across Australia. This creates greater flexibility for all learners, irrespective of your location. So I see there's some real inherent advantages for young people. And there's a skill competency base, as you pointed out, Matt, of these quals. And we know we're in a skills revolution, and that's a real fundamental thing to empower young people. Micro-credentials also often contain assessment tasks marked by qualified professionals, and they can be stacked or bundled, as I like to say, together to create credit towards a macro qualification like a degree, so that there is real scope and flexibility. But I like your observation there, Matt, about some of the challenges associated to this. And that one that you touched upon for me is around its credibility. So many micro-credential courses are offering this competency-based skill thing recognised by industry, but others may not have a strong industry connection, or a higher education backing where it might have gone through the appropriate standard checks and rigour for it to hold up successfully. So then there is an issue of credibility. My other issue with micro-credentialing moving into a private sector, and even the universities, because universities are there designed to create profit as well. We know that's how it works. My concern is the focus then purely on the notion of learning to earn for the individual who does it, rather than learning to learn?
Yeah.
And I think that's the tension for me. Yes, I want to empower these young people with the necessary skills to thrive in their life beyond school. But while they're in school, there is a real focus on how I learn, the character formation, my attention to wellness and all that. And so for me, there's that kind of little challenge or tension that exists. But there's no doubt there's a lot of opportunity here for our young people, and an opportunity for schools to partner with professional industries, because teachers can't have every bit of knowledge or skill as industries keep evolving. Yeah.
I wouldn't like us, though, to reach a point where people look at schooling, K-12 schooling, as preparation for some industry or other, rather than what we focus on, which is actually encouraging them how to learn and to question and to find out what it is they need, to talk about actually how they learn and what that means. Because it's very easy for people outside of education to say, oh, we need to have students need this or that in order to, work with industry. Well, I'm not sure that concern for industry should be high up on the, thing of what is school about, what is learning about. Ruth, anything to jump in there with?
Yeah, I was thinking about this as both Matt and Adriana and yourself, Caroline, was speaking. One of the things that you mentioned was the portability of some of these credentialing. And because we exist at the moment in a climate of competition rather than connection, it actually can make things quite difficult in terms of taking those credentials and transferring them from place to place, whether they're recognised and validated in different states, to what extent. For us as well, speaking purely from my school point of view, context matters. So sometimes a one-size-fits-all micro-credential doesn't suit the needs of our learners, particularly, we're an IB school. One of the things that also came to mind was the purpose of learning, and there's been some discussion about replacing the ATAR, for example, in New South Wales with a learner profile and what that might look like. The learner profile is actually one of the central architectures of IB. There are 10 learner profile attributes that we work towards our students becoming. And if we don't consider with things like micro-credentialing, not just the competencies in terms of skill-based, but the competencies in terms of learning and what the kids get out of it and how we document that so that we actually have a holistic view of the learner, regardless of what pathway they go down, then I think we miss an opportunity that could be, I guess, enhanced by something like micro-credentialing. And given the diversity of kids that we've got, purely in my context, we have 5 pathways for our students in senior. And all of them have different needs, and they're not well served by any one, pathway, I guess, towards micro-credentialing. So if we could have some sort of suite of things that are offered that build towards an idea of a holistic learner profile, which is not just competencies based, I think that would be something quite interesting. And that may mean cooperation rather than competition between providers of things like that, and also understanding the voices of the schools and the students and the teachers that they work with, so that what they are designing in terms of learning is actually relevant and applicable to the context that it exists in.
It's really fortunate that your students are part of an IB program that is assisting them towards a series of attributes that are transferable in their life, not just in work, but in living and learning and leading and every element of their being. And this notion of becoming is really, really profound. Not everyone has that focus, unfortunately, within our schools. Now, our schools are, as you illustrated, deeply wedded to competition. And don't get me started on ATARs and standardized testing, because I'll be here forever. And I think I've had enough podcasts where I've denounced some of those things. What's really significant is that we've already had examples, though, within schools, in our public sector, in our independent schools and in our Catholic schools for a long time, where students have been doing competency-based learning. Before the notion they were called, micro-credential. In Victoria, we know the whole vet industry has been huge. And I appreciate that it's not just then about building a skill capacity to enter into an industry, and that we need to focus on the holistic development of that individual. And I'm glad, Ruth, you brought up the notion of a learner profile. So I'm going to disclose that I am on the advisory board of Eat Up Education, which has a product on the market right now around a learner profile. So I'm disclosing that as I'm endorsing the idea of a learner profile. We're not the only one on the market. There are many others that are on the market. What we are witnessing in the schools that have adopted this practice already is, first of all, they are schools that recognize all the data they gather is human data. Yeah. It is not simply numerical data that can help them feel good about themselves, right? It's human data, that's individual data, and it should be owned by the individual student. And they should be empowered to be able to use that data so they can not only focus on their achievement, but on opportunities to grow. One of the other aspects that these schools that are using this product really successfully are doing exactly what you've illustrated, Ruth, and they are focusing on the dispositions, the character dispositions, and the reflective habits of a really effective learner. And, you know, we call them graduate outcomes. You know, you can call them attributes, but all of them are about these desired outcomes that we want them to be equipped with the necessary kind of competency, wellness, and character to be able to thrive in this world. And schools have found those type of things difficult to measure. And the argument is, does everything have to be measured, right? You know, can it not just be experienced? Nonetheless, you know, we understand that. Plus, we have the other advantage of an Australian curriculum that does have a set suite of capabilities that do look at social and emotional learning, that do look at socialization, that do look at cultural awareness, you know, that looks at intercultural understandings and Aboriginal, Indigenous perspectives and Asian perspectives and so on, and sustainability. There's real opportunity, if we want, in a curriculum that already exists and a system that already exists, to embrace opportunities to build people's character. Every time I talk to a potential employee about a student that's, you know, been in my care over the years, they just want to know what they're like. You know, they can read about their academic prowess, but they want to know are they going to fit in? What are they like in collaborating with a team? You know, do they have the capacity to work through and create solutions? Are they a responsible citizen? Are they open to being a continuous learner and unlearner? Are they a good person? You know, like simple stuff. And if we can find opportunities through our renewed model of learning, a new social contract of learning that heroes this stuff, I feel our young people are going to come out of our schools equipped with the necessary knowledge, skills, dispositions, and habits to thrive.
I wrote a piece a few years ago now. There were a group of young tech guys, and they were all guys on a panel, and they were being asked about their future employment needs. A lot of them were just finishing their masters in ICT and those, and there were some really interesting points came up. First of all, it was that employers weren't interested whether they could code or not. They knew that, they had the results, and plus they had other people that can code. They wanted to know whether you were easy to get along with. They wanted to know how you worked with other people. They wanted to know about how you managed particular difficulties. And one young man said, it was through the humanities that I learned about ethics and how that needs to be thought about in technology development. I thought that was tying in with what Adriana said. You can read about their academic things. Employers want to know if they're going to build a good team and have an employee who's not going to cost them a lot of money because they're not very nice to people. So cybersecurity. I'm very aware of time and I know we're running out of it, but cybersecurity thoughts. I know what mine are. But
I'm going to start off with this one.
Yep.
One of the challenges, and this also it feeds into equity. One of the challenges that I face in my context, being in a public school in Queensland, is actually a real difficulty accessing tools because of the fear that public education has around the security of student details and things like that. I'm currently investigating a tool that would be fantastic as an interface with my students, between teachers and students and parents, to be able to streamline communication, to make workloads more effective. And the amount of hoops that I have to try to jump through to do this is crazy. The balance between, I guess, risk and, innovation is something that needs to be better able to be addressed. There are a lot of restrictions that are placed on public schools here in Queensland about things that we can access and we can't access. We can't access any of the Google suite with our students at all. We can access the Microsoft suite, which is a great place to start. But we're not allowed to. We can't use Zoom with our students. Obviously, there's a lot of restrictions on what we can and can't use, and the storage of data in servers that are overseas and things like that, and the permissions process that goes along with that is really, really difficult. So those challenges that I guess that the powers that be face in public education around that is quite significant, and it always amuses me that colleagues in independent and Catholic schools actually have better access to a far wider suite of tools than we do. So there is actually systemic disadvantage in some ways because of this fear of cyber, of issues to do with cybersecurity.
Ruth, I'm sorry that that's the experience that you're having as an educator in that particular system, and frankly, I'm just sick and tired of educators, not you, but the system operating because they allow fear to control everything that we do in a classroom. Please, the people listening to this, please don't interpret what I'm saying that this should be a free-for-all either, right? The protection of our young people is sacrosanct. There is nothing more significant than that. And every sector needs to be deeply committed to protecting the integrity of its young people, whether it's in person or online. That's a responsibility we have as the adults and as stewards of this future generation that come through. But at the same time, we have to raise our eyes and realize that, the world is evolving at a rapid pace. We're living in times of swift technology advances, demographic shifts, rapid urbanization, shifts in global and economic power, resource scarcity, issues of biosecurity and cybersecurity, and of course, climate change. They're all impacting on society. They're all reshaping society. It's not going to slow down. So do we then, as a school, retreat and focus on control and compliance as our default? Or do we look at the opportunity that comes with an increase in connectivity in terms of the reach of being a global classroom as opposed to a remote classroom? And then what do we then have to do to navigate through that space? When I take a group of students to Cambodia for a 3-week immersion experience working with a disadvantaged community and enlightening these very privileged young men about the value of empathy and understanding and intercultural awareness, the risk assessment that I have to go through is immense. Now, I could do one or two things. I could simply say, it's just so hard. There's so many things I've got to fill in and hoops to jump. So we're not going to do that. Right? We're not going to give these people this experience or this opportunity. And I'd rather go through all those things to be able to do it. But we've got to do it in a way where we're deeply conscious more about what's going on. I mean, when it comes to the cybersecurity question, this is not my area of expertise. So for not for any moment would I suggest that I'm qualified to talk on that particular issue. But for me, it's the broader issue about how we can identify and manage complexities within the world and our system that impacts our young people and their adults, and that we manage these digital risks and we look at ways in which to protect them while at the same time leveraging the opportunities that these things can bring us. I was reading an article in preparation of this. The World Economic Forum had their Global Cybersecurity Outlook report, and they indicated that cyber attacks increased 125% globally in 2021. And there's evidence suggesting that in 2022, there'll be an uptick, right? We know this is the new frontier of credit card fraud going, nuts and a whole range of different things. And data is powerful, people. But additionally, across the world, there are nations who are working together, to think about the fact that people are going to work remotely now more often. I think McKinsey are suggesting 25% of the world's population are going to work 2 or 3 days a week remotely. That changes how they do it, right? There's an impact on the adults as well as the kids. So hybrid and remote work, increased cloud access, the Internet of Things, integration of that all creates potential vulnerabilities. But there's a lot of work going on in this space, right? Universities, Matt, I'd imagine that your university has got over 90,000 students, timetables, plus internationals, plus people who are doing micro-credentials and all of that. I mean, the data that you collect as basically a little village is immense, and so there would have to be systems in place when we work collaboratively. Yes, we do it at a local level, but we're working collaboratively to to mitigate these risks, to protect the data, protect privacy, and of course, our online safety. It just shouldn't. We just should never operate from the position of fear then prevents us from doing anything.
I think that's
Sorry,
I think that's such a wonderful. Sorry, Carolyn. I think that's such a key point. I guess my thoughts around all this is sort of coming back to the purpose as teachers, right? What are we doing, and what guides informs our decisions? Who's making pedagogical decisions around which tool I can use in my classroom? And that comes back to, and I think Ruth was speaking to this earlier around are we outsourcing pedagogical decisions, not to technicians even, but to lawyers who are looking at perceptions of risk? And is it a political decision about which tools I can choose to use that best meet the needs of my learners in my classroom who don't know my students, who don't know my classroom context? What they're looking at is how they can mitigate risk. And this is a really big issue. I see this in games-based learning all the time, is that people who are disconnected from the local context are making very sweeping decisions based on perceived risk.
Yeah.
And as teachers, we get asked to make evidence-based decisions. But when I ask for evidence around how those decisions are reached, often it's on hearsay, often it's based on stories in the media, which are based on isolated anecdotal examples. So it's really, I guess my take-home point is, if we're being asked to make evidence-based decisions as teachers in our classrooms, let's have some evidence-based decision-making around what's the real risk of using Flipgrid in your classroom.
Yeah. And I mean, we all had to, well, I'm assuming, Adriano, you did apply the GDPR, or the things around the GDPR. And one of the most significant things, of course, is the right to be forgotten. Why can't that be built in to technology so that at the end of year 12, or any data that's been collected is anonymized or just forgotten? It's just cleaned. I'd rather see at young ed tech entrepreneurs answer that problem rather than the new problem.
There are some requirements on schools, Carolyn, across every sector where they are required to keep particular types of student data and employee data for a statutory period of time.
Okay.
So that they do have requirements in that space, but that doesn't necessarily preclude what you're saying to a degree. And I think Matthew's right. This just keeps coming back to this notion of being deeply conscious about what the local context is and what their inherent needs are. And when I was saying that the governments and organisations are working together to mitigate potential vulnerabilities, it has to be done at the country and the local level, because each context is dramatically different. And we have people that have different levels of access. The truth of the matter is, right now, the four of us, so much of our own personal lives and data is out there. The four of us will get, as our listeners will get saturated with emails from companies because someone has purchased data from a company that we've said yes to at some point, and algorithms are flooding our social media with these organizations because we're fit a profile. This is why data is such big business, and companies want it because it increases their bottom line. But we have to keep working at ways in which to share the knowledge, to build our capacity and expertise in this space, to mitigate the risk in our local context. And perhaps we need to start incentivizing, the governments maybe need to incentivizing the private sector to invest in this digital infrastructure so that our public sector, particularly our public schools, don't have to burden the bill that's going to come when you need to have such robust infrastructure to protect things. There's got to be opportunities to offset this.
Yeah. So I realize your time is important, and I just think, do you have one last point that you'd like to make about the divide, about closing the gap, and how technology can perhaps be used to do that? A final, Ruth, you can begin. Final thing you want to say about anything?
I think there is such potential in technology and such potential in our young people in the way that they engage with technology. If we can look at, being purposeful with the way that we approach it, and purposeful with the tools that we take, and perhaps work with industry to be able to develop tools that satisfy the needs of the risk adverse people within governments to be able to do the things that we need to do with our young people. And I think unless we can do that, not just for the like the students in my school, but the students who are in remote areas, or the students who are in Aboriginal communities who may not have access to the same level of technology, both hardware and software that we have, we're doing our young people a disservice. And I think we're missing out on the potentials, not just for the technology, but the potentials for the futures of our young people. And we need to look at ways that we can connect, not compete, in order to be able to achieve those things.
Yeah. Collaboration over competition. Matt.
Yeah, really something that really stuck with me is quite profound was around the idea of, we talk about research translation and how we can look at translating research around technology and digital pedagogies in a way that's going to change things for our students and have a great impact. The question we're asking is not what works, but what works here. And it comes back to listening to local voices, stakeholder voices, and really involving them and empowering them to be leaders in that decision making. And that stakeholder voice is student voice, it's our families, it's our communities, it's our elders. It's really, really listening and empowering that's going to be the key.
And finally, Adriana. You're muted, Adriana.
I really love the sharing from Matt and Ruth just then about their aspirations around the opportunity and how both of them are so deeply conscious about the young people in our care and how do we best serve them going forward in the context in which they are living and existing and ultimately going to be living. The one thing I'll say about that too is we have to be conscious that the world's a classroom right now and there's real opportunity there. And so for me, learning is now transparent, it's open, and it needs to be student actualized, where their voice, their agency and their advocacy is amplified in what it is that we do. More still needs to be done to ensure that a learning ecosystem fully integrates an in-person experience with an online experience, with an in-context experience, and of course with an in-country learning opportunity, ensuring that the world is a classroom and understanding all those issues of safety in the digital space and the risks associated to them. But we're entering into a phase where I know that technology is so pervasive, but I really feel it's the age of the human, and we've got to continue to amplify a person-centered approach to our learning ecosystems. And when we do that and we place people, because people matter, at the center of our schools, I would imagine they're going to be wonderful, thriving places where our planet's going to benefit from it as well.
That's awesome. Yes. And my last thing is, I guess, that I had a really good point and it's just escaped out of my left or right ear. But it was about global, about that sort of ability to cross boundaries, to cross different national, what do they call those things? Borders, those things.
Borders.
Yeah. So yes, look, I'd really like to thank you, the three of you, Matt, Adriano and Ruth, again, for your time. The use of technology, what it's going to offer us for our students is huge. And I really think we're in for some exciting times if we stop, as Adriana said, we stop being afraid of what we can do. So we thank you very much. And to the people listening, thank you for joining us. if there's any follow-up you'd like to do, you can always leave a message in the chat, and we'll see what we can do to answer your questions. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Caroline.